Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of Toronto. My name's Peter Lowen. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Governance, and it's really my pleasure to have you here. We're very pleased today to welcome Katie Telford, the Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who's joining us this evening. Katie Telford is undoubtedly one of the most powerful people, indeed powerful women, that Canadian politics has ever seen. She was notorious for being a brilliant political strategist before she ran the last election with Mr. Trudeau, but she's known as well for having an unwavering commitment to advancing the public good. Her political accomplishments are accomplishments for all Canadians, not least her extraordinary commitment to gender equality, not only in the cabinet, but in all aspects of the operation that she runs in Ottawa. So I can't think of a more fitting person to begin our Women in Leadership series here at the School of Public Policy and Governance. This series has been made possible by, among other things, the generous support of David and Shelley Peterson, and we're glad that David and Shelley and Adam are joining us this evening as our guests, and we're grateful for their ongoing support for public policy at the University of Toronto. I'm also very pleased to be joined today by my colleague Donna Dasko. Donna, you will know, has had a tremendous impact on Canadian politics, not only through her pioneering work in public opinion research in Canada, but also in her founding work with Equal Voice Canada. So after Katie shares her remarks, Donna will open up a conversation with us and with Katie, and then we'll invite you to ask some questions. I won't say anything more except that the School of Public Policy and Governance in the University of Toronto is very pleased to welcome Katie Telford.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me and for that introduction. I'm not sure if I've been called notorious in any way before, but I appreciated that. And I just thought I would survey the room on what you know about political staffers before I get into my brief talk. I'm going to try and keep it compressed so that we can really get into Q's and A's. So I hope you'll have lots of questions or stories and comments you want to share. And so here's my brief survey of the room. How many of you, for whatever the political party, for whatever the level of government, have volunteered in politics in some fashion before or worked? That is impressive. There are very few rooms I go into like that, so that is very impressive. Second, how many of you watched, and this may or may not date the room, how many of you ever watched the television show West Wing? Special kind of room, I think. And House of Cards? Veep? Okay, how about the thick of it? Oh, so some of you still have some TV watching to do if you want to know all about political stafferdom. So what I'll say about all of that, just to give you a bit of a sense of what I do, that's a very big name, by the way, is... It's daunting even to me. What I would say is we walk around less having meetings in the hallways than in the West Wing. Might just be the structure of the building. We have a horseshoe in center block, so you really can't go round in circles. And then we have one long hallway over in what is now called the Prime Minister's Office and Privy Councillor's Office building, formerly known as the Langevin building. And we swear less than in the thick of it, so be prepared. If I did just recommend that show to you, there is a warning there. We are way less dark than in the House of Cards, and less funny than in Veep, but we do our best. What does Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister really do? I sometimes believe I go to meetings and I check email. And that in some ways is what I do. I go to a lot of meetings, and I have more email than I can keep on top of. But the really exciting way of looking at my job is that I get to advise the Prime Minister on everything that the Prime Minister is involved in. I get to sit in on cabinet meetings and caucus meetings. I got as campaign director to be a part of building the team that then got elected into government. And I manage, along with my colleague, Jerry Butts, the Principal Secretary in the Prime Minister's Office. We kind of say that we're co-CEOs of the Prime Minister's Office. We manage the Prime Minister's Office, and we indirectly manage chiefs of staff across government. And why I say indirectly manage is we don't view ourselves as their bosses. Their ministers are their bosses. But to stay coordinated and to share best practices, because there aren't a lot of people out there who've had jobs like the ones we're in, and especially not in the times that we're in. Each political time is quite different, and you might imagine that right now is a particularly unique time. And so we get together on a weekly basis amongst all the chiefs of staff across government to share what is happening. And we spend a lot of time trying to not become driven by paper and deadlines. We actually literally say that to ourselves, and to spend time instead thinking about, are we delivering what we committed to delivering in the election for Canadians? And where must we diverge sometimes from that path because of changing events? And we spend a lot of time thinking about those two things and then advising our elected officials on what those best paths forward may be. And in some ways, we're trying to help them drink from the fire hose of information that is coming at them from Canadians across the country on where they should go right versus left, straight versus still. We try as often and not to go backward. And that is, in a nutshell, the life of a political staffer. We historically, as the past premier can tell you, we political staff stay away from podiums and microphones. And we don't tend to tweet, but then Twitter wasn't around not that long ago, let alone Facebook and Instagram and everything else. But it's a bit different now for a few reasons, and it's why I really welcome and thank you for inviting me to be here. Because there's a few reasons that we've been going out of our way to speak to audiences as political staff, and particularly people who might be interested or that we could possibly sell on being interested in doing what we do, because we are constantly on the lookout for new talent and diverse talent with different experiences from across the country. And the reason we talk a bit more publicly, and I especially love the fact that the theme here is women in leadership, because as was said, it's a passion of mine, not only women in leadership, but more broadly, diversity and inclusion. As was said to the Prime Minister and I in a meeting not that long ago, diversity is a fact in this country, and I think we all know that intuitively, though we don't often pause and think about it, but inclusion is a choice. And it's not something that I think governments have actively done an excellent job, shall we say, at achieving in terms of choosing to actively make decisions about involving people in government, about involving Canadians broadly, let alone specific Canadians from diverse backgrounds in the decision-making process itself, whether it be advising in roles like mine, or whether it be in running as elected officials and becoming ministers or parliamentary secretaries or the Prime Minister himself. And one of the ways that we hope we can create more of an inclusive environment is to talk more about it, to kind of blow the doors open on it a bit. Once upon a time, and actually in some of those shows, it seems like these dark, shady back rooms, and that's where those political staffers are that are doing some questionable things at times, less so in the West Wing. And nowadays, both because of social media, you couldn't get away with back rooms if you tried, and truth be told, when Jerry and I started this adventure with the Prime Minister, then he was Justin Trudeau. I'm not sure there was ever a just, but he was by name then, just Justin. We kind of all had to do some talking because we were in third place and there weren't many of us, so we all had to fight pretty hard and pretty publicly for what we were doing. And then we stuck to it instead of shrinking into the back rooms or against the walls, because we really do believe that there's a desire, particularly among young people, ourselves included to a certain degree, we're getting older, that there's a desire for that openness and transparency as to what's really going on. How are decisions really getting made? That process can sometimes matter as much as result. And so for those reasons, I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you all about whether it be process or results or just how to get involved, or to explain better what I do. Feel free to poke me on any of those things or any other subjects. I've been told to expect anything from this audience. So a couple of things I wanted to talk about in terms of lessons I've learned since being Chief of Staff, or things that I have kind of paused on in what is almost 2 years since having the job. I started the job technically in November when the cabinet got sworn in. And before that, I was campaign director. And one of the things I started, and I'm not sure exactly when I started doing it, but was taking note of who was in the room. And what I mean by that is at the top of my page in my notebook, that's somewhere around here in my purse, I would start writing down how many men and women are in the room. And I did that at first, more just, it was informational for me. It was a bit of a lark, because I was just kind of noticing that there wasn't often that many other women. I never said anything to anybody. It was just something I wrote down on the top of my page. People clearly read over my shoulder. So there's one lesson learned. Because people took note of the fact that I was doing that. And they did that, and then I started realizing people were talking about the fact that I was doing that. And then it's become something that I now feel a need to continue doing. And I'm kind of excited that my colleagues, many of them, do it as well, both in meetings when they're with me, but also in meetings on their own. And I swear I didn't plan this, but on my way here, I got a BBM from a colleague who said, FYI, I'm at an official dinner in Italy, and there's only one woman out of 20 at the official table. So tomorrow we are going to promote the fact that Canada, this is going to be actually tomorrow, we're going to promote the fact that we had an all-woman delegation at the Innovators Summit leading up to the G7 meeting. And that is the kind of, I think, taking note and promoting, not just internationally, but here at home and within the closed-door meetings, where it may go unnoticed a lot of the time. And one of the reasons I keep track of that number is not just to tell other people and promote it, though I think that's hugely important, is unless we realize that there is this gap, we don't necessarily actively work to close it. But we also do it, or I do it, for myself. It is very easy, I have found, to start to think that being the minority in the room is normal. And that unless you write it down and kind of calculate the percentage involved, you sometimes don't even appreciate what the gap is. And I'm determined to not let it be normal. And so it is as much a reminder to me as it is to the people in the room. And it gives me, at first I kind of paused on it, but it now kind of gives me delight when someone comes into the room and says, I'd like to introduce you to this woman from my office or this department that I brought with me to the meeting. And at first I thought, well, that wasn't the point for you to bring a woman for the sake of bringing a woman. But then I thought, if this woman is now getting access to this room with the Prime Minister or whomever else is in the room, then that's a good thing. And if they keep coming, it's an even better thing. And so for that reason, I would encourage you to think about taking note of who's in the room. Whatever numbers you track, whether it's men and women, whether it's cultural backgrounds, it's just worth taking note. So, second thing I have really found, actually over a longer period of time than being Chief of Staff, is the need to be persistent and to plan when it comes to recruitment and hiring, if you really believe in that diverse and inclusive environment. Gender parity cabinet. Something you've probably all heard something about. Many of you, if not all of you, have probably heard the line because it's 2015. But as the Prime Minister has said many times, and I can tell you a little bit more behind the scenes of 2015 did not happen on its own. It did not happen by an accident or a whim. I was actually at a conference where the CEO of a pretty major company came up to me when she heard that there was a Canadian in the room. And she said, she pulled me aside for a minute and she said, can you just tell me if this story is true? Because she hadn't heard it directly from the Prime Minister. And she said, I've heard that you actually took a couple of years to get to that point, that you actually had to really work at it and recruit, and I said, true, was part of that. Oh, good, because I've been telling my international board this story, that Canada did this, and that it took time and took effort, and it has to be something that you plan for and actively engage on as a result in a project in and of itself. And I thought, well, that's really having an impact when this was a multinational company and a CEO from the United States saying this to us. So she was very excited to know the story she'd been telling a lot of people was true. But I can tell you it's true because not only did it take us a couple of years of thinking, but it took us a couple of years of experimentation. An experimentation that is not over because the numbers aren't where we want them to be yet. They're better, but they are certainly not good enough. And as you all know, in terms of the overall numbers of women in Parliament at any level of government, really, there's, I think now last I checked, 2 municipal governments in the country that have gender parity or a majority women in terms of city councils in the country. So there's work to do at all levels of government across the country. So one of the experiments that we did was, it actually came from a volunteer. And this is where it really takes leadership that listens and is willing to sometimes fail. It doesn't always work. But in this case, I'm going to give you one that did work, surprisingly. And that was a volunteer who came forward and said, we're going to send out an e-blast. Or she said, I think we should send out an e-blast. And the e-blast asks people if they know a woman who would run. So we're not actually asking someone to put their hand up themselves. We're going to ask people to tell us about somebody else, and all they've got to do is give us an email address. And we're going to tell them that the only thing we're going to do in follow-up, we're not going to start harassing that person with 101 emails or phone calls. All we're going to do is have someone then email this address that they've given us and say, it's been suggested by someone that knows you that you should think about running. Would you be willing to talk about that? Could we tell you more? Not everybody said yes, though I think everybody likes to be asked, or at least I like to think that. But a number of people did say yes, and it actually led to thousands of conversations with women across the country. And then it whittled down and it whittled down. But today I can tell you as one example that the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of International Development, who you can find on Twitter at MP Selena, she was someone who came out of that campaign. And she may or may not be where she was if we hadn't listened to that volunteer, experimented, and then followed through on all those phone calls. And as an example, though, of everything doesn't work out quite right necessarily, especially at first, is she ran in a by-election and she lost. And it was devastating. She worked really, really hard. She had a young family, and it didn't work out the first time. And we said, but you're phenomenal. You've got to run again. There's a general election coming. And she got elected that next time. And not only did she get elected the next time, if you haven't already seen her video that went viral, it was a video of her statement in the House of Commons last week, her video where she stood up in the House of Commons with her, as she called them, dope braids, and talked about body shaming. Check it out. And it's that kind of difference and diversity of voices that we need in Parliament that not only are doing things that help us here at home, but that are really sending messages around the world. And I just think that Selena is a wonderful example of that. So be creative, experiment, plan. We determined early on that we wanted a diverse team, and be persistent. I can tell you, Minister Freeland, Chrystia Freeland, who many of you may know from around the neighborhood even, but who you, I'm sure, certainly know as being our Minister of Global Affairs, and who's absolutely phenomenal, and is recognized now around the world. I can tell you she said no far more times than she said yes. But when she said yes, we took that yes and ran with it. And I highly suggest you do the same. That we just did not accept no for an answer when she said, are you kidding? I'm in New York. I have this young family. I've got this great job. You're in third place. Because, of course, we were recruiting her for a by-election at the time as well. And but look how not only how far she's come, but how far she's brought us in terms of, again, the speech she gave in the House of Commons on foreign policy in June was a first, and the work she's doing on NAFTA as I speak. So, being persistent, I think she's a great example of how that can pay off and that it's worth it. And I would just say you need to also be willing to take some heat. And when you're wanting something different, you generally do have to take some heat. Sometimes it means some headlines, and you have to question, we have to question, especially in politics, can we afford those headlines? Are they one-day stories? Are they two-day stories? Or is it something that's going to live with us that's a problem? Generally speaking, our experience so far, it's only been a couple of years, as I said, not even a couple of years, we have found that we get those headlines that say gender parity cabinet, what is he committing to? We need a meritocracy. And we also got headlines when we first got into government after the ministers were sworn in, saying we were being too slow about hiring our chiefs of staff. Well, it takes a little longer when you need to look outside the usual box of people who put up their hands and said they had past experience. If you want different people to play these roles with a diversity of, and when I say diversity, I mean ages, professional backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, gender. When you want to put all of those things on the table, it's going to take you a little longer. And you have to constantly balance not only the negative news stories, but whether from an implementation standpoint you can take that time. But our experience so far, I would argue, it's worth taking the time. It's worth taking the time if you know you're going to see results from that. And we really do believe that that diverse team and that diversity of voices around the table, from the cabinet table to the caucus, to our volunteer leadership, is hugely important, both to our success to date, but to our success going forward. And that is where we have a new topic we've been grappling with. And the Prime Minister spoke about it for the first time at what I think is a very cool summit. It's hashtag WITW if you wanted to look it up. I've been following it for years. It's the Women in the World Summit. And it's been held in New York for years. Tina Brown is the person who pulls it together. I can give you lots of other different hashtags and women's conferences and things to follow as well. But this is a recent one, because it was 2 weeks ago where they, for the first time, held a conference here in Toronto. And they did that in part because the Prime Minister had gone to New York previously and spoken at the conference last year. And Tina had been inspired by the Prime Minister's work and said, I want to do, and what Canada was up to, and said, I want to come to Canada. And so in his talk last week, in our preparation for his talk last week, he and I were talking about what's the next evolution or what's the next stage of thinking around the recruitment story that we tell. And then we said, well, it's actually what we've been dealing with and spending a lot of time talking about the last few months, and that's retention. It's one thing to recruit people, and it's another to convince them to stay and to feel valued and supported, especially when they have every reason to feel alone. When you walk through the hallways of Parliament, as more than one MP has said to me, the walls would not tell them that they belong. The portraits tend to be men with white or gray hair, and it's not necessarily the brightest, most open place. You may or may not have experienced question period. It's special, and my best word for it. So retention is an interesting thing when you have a whole bunch of MPs of different ages. We have our first cabinet minister who called up the Prime Minister and I separately a couple of weeks ago and said, so what are the rules for a baby in the cabinet room? And of course she was joking, not about having a baby, but about rules in the cabinet room for a baby, because of course there's not been a baby in the cabinet room before, but we are tremendously excited that there will be, and making sure that she has the support to be successful as a new mom and a minister is hugely important to us, because that success, I think, is going to send all kinds of signals, or we hope, to other women, both within our caucus now, but also potentially to women who aren't yet running in politics, that there's nothing that's going to hold you back there. So that's the latest challenge. But there's also the social media aspect of things, which I'm sure you all know well. It can be a pretty dark place. Not House of Cards dark, but pretty dark. And, on my birthday, I decided to laugh it off when someone told me to choke on cake. And that's pretty harmless stuff, actually, relative to what a lot of others face on there, and particularly our women politicians. And then if you're a visible minority woman politician, it can be that much more challenging. But what I hope is that if we are listening enough and talking enough about it and being open enough about it and trying to learn as we go, that we will be able to not only make the place a more welcoming place, maintain and increase the diversity of the place, but that we will be a bit of a beacon to other levels of government, let alone to other places in the world. But we really do have work to do here at home. And that is why I think the last thing I want to talk about, since I did say I was going to keep things short-ish, is probably the most exciting part of my job. It's actually not the traveling the world, though that is exciting, and meeting different people that you think you'd never have the chance to meet. It's actually just the constant learning. And it's the things here at home that get me the most excited. Everybody who works with me knows that I go to this really cool breakfast, and I'm not a morning person, but I get up for this breakfast and I don't miss it. And it's a group of women who call themselves, and I got permission to be able to talk about them once before, call themselves the AWWR, Awesome Women with Rank. They are the senior most women in the armed forces. And when some of them happen to be in town in Ottawa, they go to this really greasy spoon that happens to be right by my office. And one of them, thankfully, took me under their wing when I started as chief of staff and said, you should come and meet these women. They have remarkable stories, and very different stories, both from each other and, as you can imagine, from what I do. And I learned so much at every one of those breakfasts. My favorite meeting, and I like to think, certainly one of the Prime Minister's favorite meetings, is there are 4 themes that he identified, or subject areas that he identified early in his leadership as Prime Minister, that he wanted to have regular stock takes on. And the ministers on the relevant files will come in and say how they're doing, thus the stock take. We will invite people in from the outside to the degree that we can to give us some fresh perspective on what it is we're talking about. And so those 4 themes are, we talk climate change, we talk international priorities, we talk about the middle class and whether we're meeting the economic objectives we set out to meet for the middle class. And the 4th, which is my personal favorite, is the diversity and inclusion stock take. And the diversity and inclusion stock take has been, I have sat there in somewhat in awe, hearing what people are coming to the table saying for the first time, oftentimes, talking about what it is they're facing. So for example, there were 2 different stock takes, one where we invited the heads of all the different elements of the security apparatus in the federal government. And we said, come and tell us, give us your numbers ahead of time so that we can look at your numbers, how you're doing, what diversity levels are like in your areas, ranging from the armed forces and RCMP to the civilian side within government. And then we did the same thing on the finance and the economic side of government. We said, give us your numbers ahead of time so that we can spend the time talking about how we break down whatever the barriers are to making those numbers higher. That's the really exciting stuff. That's where you really feel like, more than when you're in some really exciting part of the world you haven't been to, it's in that room where you feel that change, where people walk out of that room and say, you have no idea the ripple effect of the Prime Minister and the ministers sitting there asking these questions and saying how much they care about these issues. And I think maybe it is, as a young-ish woman in the room who's been pushing so much on this front and often is the minority in the room, but it's in those moments where I think change is really possible. And we're not just talking change, and I think talking change is really important too. I think symbols do really matter, but that in those times we're also seeing action happen. And so being open and interested in constantly learning and pushing and being relentless on the themes of diversity and inclusion within the Canadian government and at all levels of government would just be my last kind of thought for all of you, is I hope you'll, I know, based on the hands I saw earlier, you're already joined with me on this particular cause. And I would really just encourage you to all keep pushing us, teaching us. I learn more from the women in my office often days than I do from anyone else. We actually get together as a team every once in a while, and I just say, how are you experiencing things? Because we have gender parity in the Prime Minister's office and across government for political staff, not at the senior level. So the only thing I can think of up until now, and I would welcome the professors and students telling me other things, is the best thing I need to do is to hear from them, what's it gonna take for you not to leave? What's it gonna take for you to be promoted? Why haven't you walked into my office and asked for that promotion? Because we need women to stay. We need people of, you know, as I said, a variety of, if anything, I actually have some older folks in the office who say, you need to convince us to stay too, and that's true. So we have a lot of work to do, a lot of listening to do, a lot of continued learning to do. And I would just leave it to say, there's a lot of change to be done, and I hope you'll keep doing it with me. And I did look at the alumni numbers for the school, and I do love the Ontario Public Service. I used to work with them very closely, but I'd love it if more of you came to work in politics. Thank you very much.
Hello? Oh, there we go.
Testing.
Okay, we're testing, okay. Katie, thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you.
We're really so happy to have you. It's just wonderful to have you kick off our series, our leadership series on women. Your job, you have a great job. You deal with all of the important issues of the Government of Canada. You deal with policy, you deal with politics, you deal with communications, at least, and you deal with the major issues facing the country, so it's not just government, it's issues facing Canada. I want to ask you, what is the most difficult issue you're dealing with now? I mean, what is the toughest thing that you're dealing with right now? What keeps you up at night? Really, I want to know. I want to know, like, what is it?
So the easy answer, and truthful in some ways, would be NAFTA. It could have such far-reaching impacts how this all goes. Having said that, we have, and I say this quite sincerely, we have such a phenomenal and experienced team of negotiators. As you already heard me say, Minister Freeland is awesome. And so I actually have a lot of confidence in our team on that. I think actually in terms of the thing that keeps me up at night, it's a bit of what I talked about in terms of retention. And not the thought that people are going to run away from politics, but more the thought that they might not stay with it long enough that it becomes normal for people of the different backgrounds that I've talked about and that you've seen in Parliament to be there. And we need them to be there for long enough that it does become normal.
Right.
It's a tough life.
Yeah.
That isn't built quite for someone to be traveling with young kids, or whether you're a man or a woman as a parent. It's not easy when you don't get to walk your kid to school most days of the week.
Yes.
And yet we need that diversity of opinion there too, where they can actually say in a public policy discussion about childcare, here's my very recent experience, for example, right?
Yes,
and so that is something that's increasingly in our consciousness, that we have to make sure the supports are there, and there's big institutional change required. I think for that, the ranging from whether it's Parliament schedule, it's not just tone, it's also practical things that are not there right now. Let alone, if you've just had a baby, how do you possibly vote the next day?
Yeah.
There should be a way for those constituents to still be represented. Yeah. And I don't have the easy answers on how you solve that, and thus why it could keep me up awake at night.
Yeah, okay, so, but NAFTA's the thing that's actually worrying you the most in terms of the government agenda. That's the biggest issue you're facing in the medium term, in the short term.
I think for the fall, anyways.
Yes, yes, right. You talk about retention, and I have to say, as somebody who's mainly thought almost exclusively about recruitment, how do you get women into positions of influence and power? I have never thought about the retention angle, so I think that's a new one. In fact, I saw a tweet from Lisa Raitt the other day saying, well, what is this retention business? What's he talking about? So I think you've actually cleared it up a little bit, but if I could get back to the recruitment angle for a moment, is there anything, obviously you have a passion for promoting women, making sure there are more women in the halls of power, making sure that government's more diverse. Is there one thing that you can tell young women about politics? And I think about this in particular, and I also want to ask you about the negativity of politics. We always hear about how nasty politics is today. I don't know whether it's increased or not in terms of negativity. So I wonder if you have thoughts about that. And then taking that a little further, how do you get young people to be interested? Young men, young women in particular, who seem to be more turned off by that aspect of politics than perhaps young men, although I'm not sure. But it is an issue, and especially, we hear about the bullying, and we hear about the, you referred to it earlier. It is something that a lot of women talk about, and they talk about in pretty negative, pretty problematic terms. So tell me about that. Is politics as negative and bad as it seems? And what advice do you, that's like one issue, the negativity.
If I said yes, I don't think anyone would come, so no. It's wonderful all the time. No.
Yes, well, yeah, we know that's not true, but is it more difficult, is it more negative than it used to be? I'll start with that
I think
angle
it's
on it.
different. I genuinely do find it a wonderful profession and a wonderful place to work. Having said that, I normally answer the question when people say, are you enjoying what you do? I say most days. And I think most days is an honest and a totally acceptable, good answer. Because there's always days in whatever you do that are that bit tougher for whatever the reason. I think it's hard to know whether it's more negative than in the past, because I think there are things that have progressed, particularly for women in politics, significantly from years ago. You can hear the stories from Kim Campbell and Sheila Copps of the kinds of things that were said directly to their faces that you don't experience as much now. Now you get it on social media. You get it from the anonymous person on social media. I'm a big believer, and I realize that there's at least one national newspaper chain that disagrees on this point, but I'm a believer in the block button. I believe that until there's a time where there's a way of managing or monitoring sort of what's happening on social media, I should not have to take some of the vile things that happen there. And those are the only people that I think any of us block. But I think it is reasonable to say, if you are being utterly racist or sexist, or, you know, I don't even think I blocked the person who said choke on cake, because I actually did, I probably shouldn't say that, I'm baiting the person, but I kind of decided to laugh at that. But that there are things that can be so extreme that I should be able to block those on my personal feeds. But I do think social media has been a bit of the difference, and I think we're still in a time of exploration in terms of the social media companies themselves, in terms of the audience and the receptors and the givers of the users of social media, and then the people in politics, public figures, are still learning to understand how to work those medium and what's reasonable and what's not. I think we're going to see standards change probably quite quickly in terms of, I mean, I'm sure many of you may remember in the last election there were a number of candidates who ended up having to drop out from all parties because of things that they may have said in their social media pasts. I think there's a lot still to learn when it comes to social media, but it's certainly, there is an element to social media that's hugely positive. I've met some incredible women and stakeholders across the country who I wouldn't know if it wasn't for social media, but you also get some pretty negative, vile stuff.
So as far as the negativity of politics, I mean, is it a real turnoff, do you think, for young people? What would you say to young people about encouraging them to get into politics given this environment? Is there something they should do? Do they have to be really tough? I mean, do they have to, is that part of it? Do you have to sort of suppress your own personality? Do you have to, I mean, do you have to take on those kinds of attitudes? Is that the environment that we're working in?
So, first of all, one of the things going into the last election, so when I was campaign director, we made choices very motivated by the leader, who I don't think would have accepted anything otherwise, but that we were going to focus on increasing the youth vote. And we actually did see success with that, I think, for a variety of reasons, including the volunteer efforts that we mobilized across the country, where we saw the youth voter turnout go up by a significant percentage in the last election. So for that reason, I'm highly hopeful that, you know, similar to retention in a way, it's how do we keep those young people engaged while we keep increasing that number. And the Prime Minister, as you all may know, is also the Minister of Youth, and he retained that portfolio. He talks about it all the time, both at home and abroad. He's a he-for-she champion, but not only a he-for-she champion, but has the specific sort of ambassador responsibility within he-for-she for youth. He has a Prime Minister's Youth Council, and actually a lot of our ministers, it wasn't part of their mandates or anything, but a lot of our ministers have started their own youth councils as well, and a lot of our MPs across the country, and I've even seen an MP or two from other parties, and it's possible there's more than that, who are holding local constituency-based youth councils and really engaging with young people. And I think we just have to keep finding ways of engaging and ensuring that the engagement continues and that it's not one-off. We actually have had the last few youth council meetings simultaneous to the cabinet retreat, so that ministers have been able to go in and workshop with the youth council, and the ministers always come back beaming and full of energy. So hopefully the young people are feeling the same way that the ministers are coming out of it feeling.
Is there anything you have to say to young women in particular about politics? I mean, is there anything they should do to prepare for a career in politics? I mean, what advice would you give? Because you're you're so devoted to getting more women involved, and that's really important. And young women seem to be, a particular area that might be slightly problematic. So is there any career advice you might have along those lines? Anything that you might
So this may be a little counterintuitive, but I would actually say prepare less. The challenge we often have when we're recruiting women, and you may have heard the Prime Minister say this before, is, he'll go and ask a woman to run, and he'll say, will you think of running? And they'll start asking him 1,000,001 questions. And they'll say, am I ready? And they'll want to talk to a whole lot of different people to confirm that they should have, that this is the right thing for them. Right. Meanwhile, the man who has either already proactively said that they're going to run in that riding, and obviously we're generalizing here, though there's a fair bit of research actually to back some of this up in terms of how many times you need to ask a woman to run before they say yes, versus how many times you need to ask a man. And the Prime Minister will say, he'll ask a man, and they'll say, okay, so what do I do? How do I start? You'll ask a woman, and they'll go through a whole series of both personal life questions and professional life questions. And what it means by them doing that, and this is a flaw in the system that we need to deal with, but it's also something that in parallel, I would encourage women to jump in and test it out faster, is that by women taking the time to get all their questions answered, the man is already ahead of them by the time they get in. And it's a great challenge with nomination processes in all political parties. It's a challenge with the general election, even once they're nominated, because if they're nominated later because of the process taking longer to give them that runway, well, then it means if the other candidates have been nominated, that just dive in, try it out. You can always pull back.
It's true. Women tend to feel they have to be super prepared. They have to know everything. They'll say, I don't know anything.
And I totally get that, to be clear. I mean, I'm sure I spend more time thinking about that speech or thinking about, what I should answer to this, that, and the other. Than I totally get it.
Yes.
But at the same time, we just have to force ourselves to just dive in.
Right. Little less worrying about prep and just going for it. Just going for it.
And when you said earlier, do you need to be tougher?
Not overthinking it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And when you said on the negative question, do you need to be tougher, and particularly young women, I really hope not. I really hope that we don't actually have to change ourselves, that actually we can find ways to change what's around us instead, by talking about what it is we're experiencing. Because I actually do think the more people don't realize. I actually mentioned the choke on cake thing to my parents who I was visiting in Toronto last night, and they were somewhat aghast. So don't tell your parents when you get things like that on social media.
No.
But you do actually need to talk about these things. It was the important bit of everyone responding to what happened to Catherine McKenna last week. And it was one remark, and some people have said, well, should we really have jumped all over that one remark? Well, yes, because those individual moments are actually generally representative of many more things. And if we don't loudly and clearly say that's not okay, then what we are asking people to do is change themselves. And that's then not bringing the same diversity to the table.
Right. You were the campaign director for the 2015 Liberal campaign, and that's a very big job, and that's a lot of responsibility. You went, as you said, from third place to first place, and not only first place, you actually won the election. So that is rare as a pollster for sure. I know that that's a very rare situation. What was it? I mean, what were the strategies and tactics? Like, what really won it for you? I know you might be tempted to say the wonderfulness of your leader, but I want you to tell us about the about what you think worked. I mean, it happened during the campaign itself. Campaign started in August. It was a 2.5-month campaign, very long campaign, and the turnaround happened right in the middle of the campaign. So what do you attribute it to?
So in terms of what the public saw and the pollsters saw, I think to a large degree the pollsters saw, mid-campaign was when the turnaround happened.
Yes.
But almost similar to the gender parity cabinet, and there were a lot of things that led to that point. There are people who point to the magical moment. And I think there were a number of magical moments during the campaign we were fortunate enough to experience, but those magical moments did not happen by accident. One of those moments that Jerry and I often talk about was there was a huge rally out in Brampton. And we held it in an arena. And the reason that I would say that we had to make a huge financial commitment to not only book that arena weeks in advance when the public was not seeing us potentially winning this. We had to assume we could fill the arena and have the confidence that we had the organizational capacity to do that. We also put money into setting it up as a potential ad location, and it did actually become one of our, what we considered anyways, we're obviously a little biased, but one of our most exciting English language ads of the campaign. And we had to make all those decisions weeks
Was that the
before
Parliament
the rally.
ad with Prime Minister walking past Parliament? Was that the one?
No, that was
Okay.
So that was at the
That
very
was later.
beginning of the
Oh,
campaign,
that was-
actually,
okay.
when
Okay.
he the I'm ready.
Okay. Yeah.
In response to the conservative attack
Right.
ads. So this was him standing in front of 7,000 people. And so the magical moment for me, it was magical because that was when I started to really believe all the hard work was going to get us to where we hoped it would, was when Jerry called me and said, "Get your something down here. You need to come experience this rally with me." And so I did, and I called up my parents and I said, "Come see this political rally and we'll see how it goes." And we went out there and we were stuck in traffic, surrounded by school buses on the highway, all going to the rally. And I was like, okay, so we're gonna fill the place. This is good. But it wasn't, to get to a place that we could have 7,000 plus people in an arena like that meant we had built an organization for a couple of years. And I really do credit our ground organization. You're right. The leader was critical, essential, and performed extraordinarily well through the campaign. That should not go without being said. But the volunteer movement that he encouraged and he believed in from the moment he entered the leadership race. And we really started building that movement from then. And actually, the word movement in and of itself was a bit of a key decision. One of the things that we found, and actually the Prime Minister felt very strongly about, because he'd stayed very connected as a local MP to young people and had been a youth critic and a teacher, was, we were seeing young people being less and less interested in getting involved in a political party. But yet, we know that young people are interested, and some of our most passionate advocates, on all kinds of issue-specific things. And so, and could get really excited if there were clear actions to take. And so we built out this, and we went and learned from the Obama 08 campaign in particular. And we also went and researched campaigns from all over the world. And then we just tried a whole lot of new ways of organizing. And then we just kept tracking those numbers. We brought in someone actually who held our, who managed our volunteer organization after about this would have been after he became leader. And she'd never worked in politics before. She actually ran the volunteer program and a music festival in Montreal, where she had to bring in hundreds of young people as volunteers every year to manage the music festival. And she applied some of that thinking to it. So we really just tried to go outside of the box, and I think building in terms of how to build a political movement in Canada. And that put us in a place that when the other pieces came together, we had the organization on the ground to pull out that vote, and particularly that higher voter turnout amongst young people than we'd seen before. But I could talk about the campaign all day, so be careful.
Of course. No. Well, thank you so much for answering these wonderful questions and having this conversation. It's time for everyone in the room to ask questions, and Peter's going to take over. Thank you so much.
There is a microphone circulating, so if you'd like to ask a question, we have time for 2 and maybe 3 if you're short and to the point. So if you want to ask a question, just put your hand up and we'll bring a microphone to you, or you can stand up and belt it out. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you for coming and speaking to us. It's been great. I had a quick, I guess, hopefully quick question for you. Sorry.
There's a microphone for you right there, yeah.
Oh.
Hi.
So my question was, in regards to basically what you were saying, that women overthink and they undersell themselves quite a bit. Like, I've worked in quite a few industries and I've seen that quite a bit. If you had unlimited time, money, resources, where would you put that to fix that sort of, I guess, that will in us to not promote ourselves as much as men do, or to not go above and or to not take the opportunity because we don't think we're good enough, like whether it's education or employment or anything like that, other than the great moves that you've already been doing in government, where would you see the solution lies?
So there's a lot of answers to that question. I'll try and give you one for the moment, is that I think that advocacy organizations I think Equal Voice has done a phenomenal job. I thought Daughters of the Vote, for those of you that followed that last spring, was, and I encourage you to look it up, I won't go explaining it all now, is a phenomenal thing. But there haven't been the advocacy organizations. There used to be the National Action Committee for Women and organizations like that just have, frankly, weakened and or disappeared in the last number of years. And I think some of those organizations and voices not having the backing, and not just financial, but the backing of communities, they need voices and platforms again, so that there can be other ways of supporting women into these institutions. Because I think it's a lot of storytelling that needs to happen, and the more places we can tell these stories and learn from each other and learn what's not working and try to problem solve together, the more organizations like that are coordinated too, so that they're not all stepping on each other, which can be a problem too. I feel like, and that's something I've just started kind of talking to people about, or actually other people started talking to me about, and I thought is something we really need to spend some time thinking about. And I think Maryam Monsef, the Minister of Status of Women, who's a phenomenal young woman and is doing just an awesome job there. And I would, on the one hand, I want to say stay tuned, and on the other hand, I want to say reach out to her and work with her on this. There's a lot that I think Status of Women could be doing, and it's for the first time being treated like a full department. And non-agency has a full deputy minister, and I'm hoping things like that will help grow some of these organizations that can lend platforms to more voices.
Thank you, that was great.
We have time for just one more.
Sorry, my answers.
So we'll go to this person right here. Thank you very much. Oh, do we?
Yeah.
We have more time to go.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
First of all, I'd like to welcome you to Innis College. I'm on the Innis College Council.
Thank you.
So I have to not let the School for Public Policy take all the glory. And MP Selena is a new college graduate, and I'm pleased to have actually done some things with her. My question, though, is actually not about politics, which you've primarily been talking about. But one of the remarkable experiments which the Prime Minister introduced was the method of appointing people to the Senate. Mm-hmm. And now that there is a very large group of non-affiliated people in the Senate, how are you going to get your legislation through, particularly if they're going to meet as a group and possibly gang up on everybody else? So if you could talk about that policy implementation, I would really be interested.
So maybe you have information I don't have. So we'll have to talk later.
I just read, no. I read the Globe and Mail. Denise is here from the Globe.
It's something actually, there's a great example of where we have been trying new things and adjusting as we go and spending a lot of time talking about it. And there's going to have to be a lot of new and different kinds of relationships built, I think, between the two places, as they're known there. And I don't know that there's a secret sauce to it yet, because it is so new. But I do think it's going to take a lot of listening and a lot of talking, and hopefully not a lot of ganging up.
Alex tells me we have time for 2 more questions. So let's take 2 more. Let's go down here to the front row. Yeah.
Hi. So Justin Trudeau has obviously gotten a lot of attention for his looks. And I'm curious about how you view that and how you've chosen to handle that strategically. Do you see it as an advantage or a disadvantage? Obviously, there's a gendered aspect to it as well.
There is, and actually there was a paper written by a U of T student who recently graduated, finished her PhD. I think it might have even been out of this school, and who I just hired. because and I said, make me smarter, was my mission to her. And she actually wrote a paper on how his boxing, Susan Delacourt actually subsequently wrote an article on this, and I would encourage you to look it up or look up actually the actual paper, since I imagine, given it's a U of T student, there's going to be a way to find that. And she wrote a paper on actually the boxing fight. Match, whatever. I'm clearly not the boxer in the office, and sort of how gender did or didn't play into that, and sort of the machismo effect of all of that. I was one of the people that told him not to do the fight. I will admit, and yet there were some great positive ripple effects from that in terms of how the public responded to the fight. Interestingly, his hair. So. Because that's really what we're talking about, right? I mean, there's the socks and the hair. And the socks is, I mean, there was Chewbacca last week, and it is what it is. The hair. So we actually had to make some decisions during the campaign as to how to deal with the hair, because I talk about it like it's its own thing. It almost is. Because the Conservatives were going after his hair. And we decided, and it was an example of sort of experimenting again, and we really did hem and haw on this, I have to tell you, and it was our digital team who are sort of they're the hip people in the campaign office in many ways, and they said, we've got to be willing to make fun of it and tease a little about it, and they put together this whole animation where it had comments about his hair throughout it, and that was almost our way of sort of accepting it and dismissing it at the same time. And I think, and he'll make the odd comment about it too. And I kind of feel like that's what you have to do, or at least that's what he has to do, is accept it, take it as a compliment as much as he possibly can, but dismiss it, because it's not what's actually important to politics and to good public policy, and it's not actually what Canadians care about. So while everybody gets a laugh out of it, it doesn't bring us votes. It perhaps brings us engagement in interesting ways. I will say that the socks have got us into all kinds of publications that no public policy gets us into. I do not advocate for the socks, to be clear, either, but they have, it was interesting, the Chewbacca socks, we were all kind of joking about it afterwards, were written about in all these publications beyond the Globe and Mail. And they all talked about his speech at the UN. So it's not to say it's a tool in our arsenal, it just happens to be something that we're recognizing for what it is right now. It's a kind of pop culture thing, and we run with it to the degree we can, and then we try to dismiss it as much as possible and focus on what we believe really, really matters to Canadians, which is not that.
The last question, Marvin.
I have a question for if you had any advice for guys who are trying to be better allies for their female colleagues, and how to get other guys, male colleagues, to join in the movement.
So I don't just say this because he's my boss, but I think following his lead a bit is a good place to start. Take a lot of the things I said, I hope, are things that are things men and women can do. Taking note of who is in the room, I am pleased, is something that my male colleagues do too now. And they may have before, but we do it more overtly now. And the Prime Minister himself, whether it's with international delegations or domestic ones, whether it's a stakeholder coming in, whether it's public servants coming in, whether it's a minister's office, whatever the configuration of people in the room, if he walks into a room and sees an almost entirely male, and sometimes entirely male room, I say almost because I'm often there, he'll comment on it. He'll say, "Whoa," and he doesn't lecture, he'll comment on it. He'll say, "There's work to do here, isn't there?" And that sentiment, showing that he's noticing, you showing that you're noticing, in whatever the room is that you're in, I really do think that makes a big difference. And it not only makes a difference in terms of how it may impact the men in the room who hear that comment, but for potentially the minority of women in the room who hear that being commented on, it's empowering for them to think it's important that they're there. And it keeps them coming, I think. it keeps me coming, it keeps me motivated when I hear him talk like that. And so I think if we can all be doing that, we will start to see more diverse rooms.
So thank you for a really intriguing question and answer period. As a student leader with the Gender Diversity and Public Policy Initiative here at the School in Public Policy and Governance, I just want to thank you on behalf of my class and the entire room for being here today. I think it's fair to say that everyone found the talk very insightful, particularly the future policymakers in the room today and maybe now future political leaders. You've left us with some really interesting insights on what we now know is the best job in Ottawa and the importance of women in leadership, and as you put it, diversity and inclusion more broadly. So I ask my fellow MPP colleagues and everyone in the room today to join me in thanking Katie Telford for launching our Women in Leadership series.